Hello. Thank you for joining us for the Let's Talk Ethics in AI panel discussion with AI experts, Udacity webinar. My name is Jared Moulton. I'm the Vice President of the Consumer Business at Udacity. Since 2011, Udacity has built our reputation as a world-class learning platform. We specialize in helping professionals develop job-ready skills through real-world projects that help them reach their career goals. Last week, we launched a 1-hour Discovering Ethical AI course taught by Ria Sharuvu, who's also one of our panelists today. The course will be available for free until May 10th. After that, it will be available to customers who have a Udacity All Access subscription. During this webinar, we'll discuss AI and ethics, and I'm joined by a panel of experts, including Ria Sharuvu, Stacey Ann Berry, and Ed Wiley. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us today. We'll spend the first 45 minutes in the panel discussion and then open the floor to questions. You can submit your questions directly in the Zoom chat. With that, let's get started with some introductions. Could each panelist introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more about what they do? We'll start with you, Ria.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ria Sharuvu. I'm an AI software architect and someone who's very passionate about data science and artificial intelligence. I have been working in the AI space for about 6 years now, and in my previous role at Intel, had the opportunity to serve as a AI ethics lead architect, developing ethical AI and trustworthy AI products and solutions, and helping influence public policy for the industry. I'm really excited about the opportunity to have this webinar, to speak with you, all of you, and to get to speak with Stacey and Ed as well. And yeah, excited to be here. So thank you.
Thanks, Ria. Stacey.
Good day. Good day, everyone. Really excited to be here. So I am a public policy professional with over 10 years experience in the public sector and worked in various management roles. I'm also the founder and president of B. Stellar Group, Inc., which is a government relations and professional development firm based in Canada. We build strategies and proposals for companies that want to lobby for policies that benefit the public. I'm also an instructor with Udacity for the course AI Governance, Policy, and the Public Good, which was launched very recently, just a few months ago. I'm also really passionate about ensuring how we protect human rights in the development and deployment of AI. I recently completed an AI policy clinic with the Center for AI and Digital Policy based in Washington, D.C., and learned how to evaluate if government legislation in various countries as it pertains to AI development is sufficient to protect fundamental human rights. So really excited to be here and to connect with everyone. And thank you to those of us who've joined us today.
Thank you, Stacey, for joining us. Ed.
Hello, everybody. I'm a career engineering and AI exec and consultant. I studied with some of the pioneers in the AI field during a doctoral degree at Stanford. Once I completed that, I went to McKinsey for several years, focusing on tech and financial services clients. I have taught at Stanford, Santa Clara, and University of Colorado, which is where I chaired a doctoral program for the better part of a decade in what today we might call data science. I left the faculty to go into executive roles. I led machine learning and AI practices as chief data scientist at Sears, CTO as a biotech and a health tech startup, and then CIO at one of the nation's leading enterprise software companies. Over the last decade or so, I've served mid-caps and smaller large caps, several startups on data architecture, machine learning strategy, and implementation. And today, most of my work is what everybody is talking about, which is generative AI. In December with Udacity, I created and launched Generative AI for Business Leaders, a little plug there, which followed a similar structure to Data Science for Business Leaders, which I had created and launched with Udacity during the pandemic. I'm really excited to be here this morning.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks again to all of our panelists for joining us. We appreciate you making the time out of your busy schedules to spend some time with us and our audience. So with that, I'd love to understand, when did you first get interested in AI, and how did you begin your learning path to become an AI expert? We'll start with Ria again.
Okay, sounds good. So I think, in terms of background, I started off learning about AI during my bachelor's in CS. It's kind of a topic that every CS student will come across, or anyone who's interested in computer science will start to think about in terms of the implications of AI on computing, on the way that we interact with devices that we use every day, like our smartphones and our watches. So I think that, as part of that inflection point, I kind of made a decision during my career to actually go into data science, just because I was curious a little bit more on, data processing, infrastructure, and also trying to get a little bit more specialized into AI systems. I'd say that kind of motivated a lot of the interest that I got in the AI space specifically, because data science gives you a raw, unfiltered perspective of, what exactly are the pain points of AI systems? What are they built based off of? And how important data and the surrounding environment is for an AI model to be able to thrive, or essentially for a business or, an organization to be able to create successful AI strategies. So as a part of that, I think AI ethics is really very, very nestled close to that as well, right? When we think about it in data science, these are not things that we list as afterthoughts. They're actually very clear, precise points that we integrate at the stack of every layer of our data science workflows and processes. So I'd say that kind of interest, that background really motivated me to jump into AI and start to look at things as is, minus the hype, and see what exactly is the back end, the building blocks behind these systems. So I'd say that that's kind of the key motivating factor.
Thanks so much, Ria. Stacey, interested to hear a little bit more about your journey.
Certainly. So I have a very unconventional journey because I don't have a traditional STEM background, which is, helpful in this sector. So my public policy background over the last 4 years, I realized that there needs to be a public policy lens and an equity lens to AI development and deployment. So for the last 4 years, I've been doing just my own personal research, doing talks at various tech conferences, many of them based in the United States. And I noticed that there was just not enough focus on the impact of AI, especially on communities of color. So I really started looking into different sectors, whether it's from the legal system and the health system, and existent inequalities and some of these systemic barriers that people from communities of color face, especially marginalized community. And what does it mean for people who just don't have access? Do we have enough policies in place to ensure that everyone has the equal access to participate in this digital age? And so, my research allowed me to come up with frameworks that included like a community development framework, making sure we think about who's being helped and who's being harmed by the inequities within AI development, or when we think about algorithmic bias, for example. And so it's been a very interesting journey. And I think it's really important to amplify the voices of more women, more people of color in this space, because too often when you look at the use cases of who tends to be more likely to be the victims of AI harm, it's usually those who already are marginalized from society. And so there is a lot more to learn. There's legislation being developed, and I have to keep my eye on top of it as a public policy professional, because this does impact the work that I do for clients who are in the tech incubator space, working with individuals and tech founders who are trying to use tech for good and using AI to solve certain problems across various sectors. So it's a fascinating space. And for those who are on the call, I do, encourage you to kind of learn more, pay attention to some of the new policies that are coming down the pipelines.
Thanks, Stacey. And I know we have some time later on to talk a little bit more about those policies. What I love about your story is it's a great indication that anybody can get into the AI space. You don't need to have that STEM background. There's a lot out there. And while this is an opaque space, presumably for the most part, there are ways to get into it. Ed, I'd love to hear your story.
Sure. Mine is a little bit more technical. And I didn't really intend to be in AI. I'm almost an accidental, it was almost an accidental exposure. During the mid-90s, during my doctoral work, my first quarter, I had a course with Brad Efron, who created a technical algorithm called the Bootstrap, which underlies many of the algorithms that we have today, and two, provided my first introduction to the power of how a computer can be used to bring statistical methods to situations that are much more broad than what traditional inferential statistics could do. I followed that up with Jerry Friedman's course on neural nets, and the example was, it blew my mind. It was a situation where we were taking JPEGs of numerals to identify what number had been written as a service for the US Postal Service to automate some of their delivery of mail. And I remember thinking, wow, first of all, I don't think I even knew that images were made up of little pixels at the time. So I was pretty naive. But I thought, when this becomes more powerful and computers become more powerful, we're going to be able to do an awful lot. And boy, have we seen the fruits of that now. And then I took a course called Statistical Learning that Trevor Hastie, a pioneer in the field, taught, and these things just blew my mind. And I realized, well, machine learning, which is what we called it back then, we didn't really think about AI as connected to it. People were doing AI work in a couple different fields. It just ran as a thread through all the different experiences of my career. And so now, as we think about the impacts of AI, I work very closely with execs on bringing AI to their organizations. And we have to think very specifically about the AI ethics and responsible AI use and how you bring this in a way that that is responsible. So that's really fun. I'm actually really looking forward to learning from Stacy and Ria here too, because I would not call myself an AI ethics expert.
Great. Well, thank you so much all for sharing those stories. This is about ethics and AI. So I'd like to open the floor now to learn a little bit more about how each of you define ethical AI. And what is your quick summary of this is ethical AI? We'll start with you, Ria.
Okay, let's go ahead and dive deeper. So if we think about ethical AI, there's a lot of definitions out there. Again, just putting one out there, we're really looking at the socio-technical impact of algorithms on our society. And I think Stacy and Ed really articulated the value of it. Jared, you mentioned it as well, which is that, technical formulations or basically approaches is just one part of the problem or the opportunity as well. So we're really looking at different fields, different approaches and methods and techniques that are being grouped in order to analyze and ensure that we have a positive impact of AI algorithms on societies. So that can mean a couple of things, but that actually means that we distill ethical AI concepts into key principles. So some examples of these principles that are really critical today are fairness, for example, where we consider, the use of AI models and start to plan for it to say, how can we prevent AI models from producing incorrect predictions, right, for certain populations over others? Very distilled to the bare bones definition. What this means is that some users of the AI technology or who are being impacted by the AI technology are getting a disparate impact or getting different results compared to others. How do we minimize that? How do we ensure that there's an similar or an equivalent experience across the board where necessary, and that there is incorporation for uniqueness and diversity as well? It's a very challenging balance to strike, but it's also something that we need to consistently strive for with AI systems. There's also other AI principles like sustainability, which considers the carbon footprint of AI systems at large. And this is a really big issue with generative AI. We're getting more and more powerful AI models that are being trained on larger and larger data sets with billions and trillions of parameters. And naturally, that's having an impact on the water, for example, on carbon footprint and, the comparisons to what exactly we're doing in relation to the environment. There's also other principles, right? We look at things like safety, security, and privacy, which are in and of themselves incredibly large spaces. The example that I love to give is that, let's say you have a robotic arm, right, that is powered by an AI system. There are some, traditional disciplines like functional safety that are really looking at making sure to minimize the harms with, manufacturing equipment, right? You don't want your arm to swerve around and accidentally hit someone. You want to be able to plan for it, incorporate uncertainty, and be able to ensure that the system is trustworthy in a sense. So I would argue that a lot of these considerations, right, come under the ethical AI domain because they're focused on the intention of AI systems and making sure that that has a important positive, beneficial impact on the users, the stakeholders, and then the societies that are impacted by them. The final element that I'd add, apart from all of these principles that's really critical is transparency, where, if you're working on an AI algorithm, on a technique, make sure to be able to explain it in detail, right? Being able to break down key processes, key mechanisms behind these algorithms. So I'd say this is a summary of some of the key principles that are motivating the ethical AI domain, focused on, the societal impact of these algorithms and the way that different stakeholders are interacting with AI. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Ria. Stacy, what is your definition of ethical AI?
Certainly, I do agree with everything that Ria has outlined so wonderfully, and that's really helped us to really break it down. But I would just add to the fact when we think about who's using AI and what is it being used for. So I'm personally, and a lot of people, especially in the advocacy community, is concerned about AI being used for surveillance. As we know, we're seeing more and more cameras being popped up everywhere in public spaces and using facial recognition technology, which in itself has its own biases. But however, when we think of law enforcement's use of it, it's not necessarily transparent. We're not sure who's being surveilled, what they're being surveilled for, how and why this type of technology is being used in public spaces. We know that there's the argument it's, for safety, they're looking for criminals, but there's a lot of research that came out of MIT that talked about the biases within the facial recognition technology, that when it comes to women and people with darker skins, it misidentifies them as criminals. So then you're creating a whole set of other problems in terms of, the state using it in this type of way. We have issues during the pandemic, especially where there was a lot of protest happening due to some of the racial injustices in the United States. And then you're seeing how the hyper focus on certain groups of people being more surveilled than others. And so when we think about ethics, like it has to be administered in a fair way, there has to be transparency. Another principle is informed consent. So too often we just sign, I agree, whether it's social media apps that we're using, but what are we agreeing to? Because some of the language is not plain language, it's a lot of legalese. So ethics is really making sure that those who are deploying these systems, whether it's through a digital means or in society through facial recognition technology that's becoming more common in all these spaces we go to for accessing certain spaces, that, there's transparency. There's the option to opt out. There's a great organization, the Algorithmic Justice League, that talks a lot about how we can better understand how to exercise our human rights in this regard, and that we should have a choice and an option to opt out. So we become really concerned in terms of what type of ethical framework are we building when choice is becoming less and less in terms of what we can and cannot say yes to. And so really ethics is really about ensuring that, also there's fairness and there's some sense of social inclusion, that we're not excluding certain people who don't have access to technology to access essential services. So when we think about, some of these grocery stores that are using a complete AI digital system in order to access the store and to purchase things, well, if you don't have a smartphone, then you can't participate. So what message are we sending to those who may have certain social or economic challenges, where now, because of technology, they're further excluded? So when I think about ethics, we don't want to marginalize more people or create more of an economic or social divide. And so that's how I would, describe the importance of ethics and what it means.
Yeah, I agree. It's really interesting because you kind of hear both sides of the coin there, kind of the inputs to the AI, which I think is a lot of what Ria spoke about, and how kind of a company manages that, and then the impact or implications of the AI to society, which is the other side of the coin there that you spoke to, Stacy. Ed, do you have anything to add on top of that in terms of your definition of ethical AI?
Just at a really high level, when I talk with executives, I'm trying to emphasize that ethical AI is when you develop systems not only to optimize some benefit, which is usually financial, certainly business related, but you're also considering the impact on society, things that are not necessarily considered by the people who are bringing it in for profit terms. And so this requires a lot more specific attention on things like what Ria and Stacy just said, all the different principles like bias, inclusion, fairness, privacy protection. And the only other thing that I really emphasize is just it's not development and then you've got an ethical AI system. You have to have continuous monitoring, you have to have continuous review, and you have to expect that your ethical AI program really is a living program within the organization.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that one, Ed. And actually, I have this question for later, but I think you set it up for now. So why don't we jump right into that? Ethics in AI, like humans, is subject to best intentions. So how do we scale ethical AI such that we can enforce its principles in development? And Ed, why don't we start with you on that one? Oh, hit the computer there.
Yeah, it's tricky, because best intentions, human interpretation, these are the issues that make this a really, especially for people in a field that's largely quantitative at its algorithmic level, at its implementation level. Those aren't things that they're naturally ready to grapple with. So it's really important that a company embrace the opportunity, that they say, this is an opportunity for us to be leaders, and let's develop a statement of responsible use. Let's have an oversight committee. Let's actually understand this as even a kind of crass, but a branding opportunity. This is your way of your organization can build trust with employees and the public, not because building trust is your ultimate outcome, but because it's the right thing to do. And it's the more responsible thing to do. And so there are opportunities for companies to do different things and in their development process. You've got foundation models that have questionable IP lineage. That's how do you use those? How do you think about performance and incorporation of a foundation model that at the end of the day might be ruled restricted use because of the way it used its training data. So you've got these ethical principles that must be there right in this forefront of your AI program, and it needs to involve impact assessments over time. You have to review for bias, and the real key here, and I think this is really important. This is the last thing I'll really say is you need diverse perspectives. You can't bring your entire program to be led and informed by people within the organization. There are so many different ways that you can get tripped up with ethical AI, and we're still trying to define even what it is. So having people from different groups, from the outside, different users, different perspectives are going to be really important here, because there is no tried and true accepted framework for the issues you must avoid. We're still really realizing what those are. So it is one of the more tricky things that you have to grapple with when you're bringing in an AI program.
Sounds great. Ria, I'm curious to hear your perspective. How do we scale and enforce ethical AI across organizations or during development?
Yep, absolutely. And I think Ed shared some really great insights into the perspective around that, especially because when we think about scalability, right, we're thinking about performance metrics, we're thinking about KPIs from an organizational perspective. And again, it can be industry, academia, government, nonprofit, right? We're always thinking about metrics around, how exactly do we take these models and then make them robust, make them apply to a variety of setups in the real world, right? So scalability has a very broad definition. When we think about ethical AI, I think this is kind of playing to what I mentioned earlier, which is really that idea that, from my personal perspective, ethical AI shouldn't necessarily be, again, like an afterthought when it comes to scalability. It's something ideally that we're thinking about as we're building our AI stack, right? Or leveraging another AI stack, right? As the fundamental elements or the building blocks. So whether that's, as Stacey really, really clearly elucidated, having fairness checks, right? Or for example, being able to check and test on different types of data, being able to better understand the risk around applications like facial recognition, and being able to identify these concerns ahead of time, and then being able to act on them, right, before we scale the technology. And I think a really good example of this that I also cite in the Discovering Ethical AI course, because it's a very simple way of understanding it, is, soap dispensers, for example, right? So, some of these technologies, there was some, news and some comments a couple years ago around how soap dispensers may not be able to recognize folks of dark skin. So what's the impact of that, right? It just means that, lighter skin folks are getting soap dispensed as part of the dispenser, but darker skin folks are not able to get that, right? This is ideally something that we solve after, before kind of production of the devices and the technology before it's actually released into the real world and having an impact on our users, on the people that we care about, right? That we're trying to optimize for. So I'd say that, this kind of element is key, right? Thinking about it while we're actually building the stack or leveraging the stack, incorporating elements of ethical AI to help it scale. And that's how we then start to think about, how do we start to design metrics so that we can check ourselves, quantitative and qualitative? How do we start to get, unit testers or, external auditors who can help us with validating that strategy? So these are like a couple of tips in terms of, an organizational strategy towards scaling AI ethics.
Super. You mentioned metrics. What are some of the, KPIs or success metrics that come to mind in terms of measuring the impact of ethical AI? And do you see that, across each principle, or is there a North Star metric? How do you view that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating conversation. Metrics have evolved so quickly in the ethical AI space. I've been kind of tracking the technical metrics conversation, right? And also, with the opportunity to contribute to some of these, we start to look at kind of the way that each of these principles exactly kind of presents a set of metrics for themselves. Again, I think the danger here is you don't want to rely on a metric necessarily to give you the full picture, right, about your system. For example, with technical fairness definitions, right? These metrics optimize for different things. They look at different things, right? So it means that you may need to use a variety of metrics. And also, as I mentioned, get that external perspective or even internal auditing, which is absolutely crucial, right? For making sure that the metrics are accurate and also your adherence to them is accurate. But that being said, and again, based off of what Stacy shared, I think we're standing on the shoulders of giants, right? I know that there's a number of different amazing researchers and, talented engineers in the space, including, Timnit Gebru, Margaret Mitchell, and many others who have created, some techniques. One of them is the model card, right? It's a very popular way of documenting kind of, your model's kind of metrics. Stratification are essentially, testing the model on different subsets of data. For example, maybe folks of different skin tones, or maybe folks who are, disabled compared to folks who are not, right? For, a pedestrian estimation use case. So, there's a lot of different ways to incorporate these elements. But yes, we have fairness metrics from that angle, model cards for transparency, carbon footprint measurement techniques, right? For sustainability and many other kinds. And of course, for security, safety, and privacy, a plethora of techniques coming in from traditional computer science and security domains that we can leverage. But I think the ethical AI domain really asks us to kind of pull these all together in a holistic perspective. And again, think about the pain points, the challenges, and the limitations of these metrics as well, and make sure we're thinking about the bigger picture. So it can be challenging to get started, but once you start to map out the landscape, you can identify the right metrics that are useful for you and for your organization and go from there.
Thanks, Ria. Stacy, I'm curious to hear your point of view here. So, as you think about scaling ethical AI, how do you enforce it across different organizations?
Yeah, I mean, and it is a challenge, as Ria and Ed outlined, in order to do the scaling, because, there's these kind of profit-driven motives that tend to advocate for policies that could be in their favor and sometimes more in their favor than the favor of society and what would benefit society. So one of the ideas that I thought of, and I shared this in another talk that I did, is the idea of having almost like an ethical AI commissioner that is arm's length, independent of the government, nonpartisan. We have them in Canada, like privacy commissioners, and their role is to ensure that there's checks and balances on the private sector side, but also the government side in terms of certain types of new technologies they might deploy on society, to ensure that it's in line and consistent with existing privacy laws and legislation. And so, everything that Ria outlined, I 100% agree with, because you need to have metrics that aren't too static, because they have to evolve as technology evolves. And so you want to make sure that, there's the right accountability measures, that you have a multidisciplinary approach, so that we include the different perspectives of those that are, both the STEM but also non-STEM professionals. So I'm thinking of our psychologists that can really help us to assess what is the impact on our well-being when we think of AI development and deployment. You want to have, of course, the public policy professionals, more lawyers in the space, and then the users. Like, the user experience is essential, because sometimes, technologies roll rolled out without really consulting and engaging community of different social economic statuses, people with different abilities. So really having kind of a wider approach, and so that you're not assuming, or there isn't this assumption that everyone's on a level playing field and you just kind of roll this thing out and then you scale it without even consulting or engaging with the users of the technology. And I find too often things are scaled and then it's like, oh, what did we do? And then you want to drop, kind of scale back and then correct the issues. But as you're building it, you need to build in the proper ethical principles, the proper guidelines. And I also think we're scaling, or we're moving really quickly, and quicker than even legislation can keep up with, quicker than organizations can start adopting, some of this technology. So we might need to kind of take a bit of a pause just so that we make sure we get it right, because you don't want to scale and then have harms that are caused that are pretty much hard to undo because it's impacting people's lives. When we think about sectors like, healthcare and the legal system, with people again being misidentified, being wrongfully accused, and then now that's changing their entire life. And so it's really important that we take our time with this to make sure that we get it right.
Thanks, Stacey. So we've talked a bit about the different principles that are associated with ethical AI. I'm curious to hear your point of views of what challenges that you have faced in your own experience with an ethical AI issue where you were able to use these principles to help address it. Ria, let's start with you for this one.
Sure. So I think, and I love this question because it kind of prompts some exploration. So just kind of thinking about it, I think one of the first issues that in terms of like just an ethical problem statement or an ethical AI problem statement that I encountered was when we were kind of doing a final project for a course that I was taking during my master's. And essentially we were given hypothetical employee survey data, right, and asked to build a machine learning model off of it. And, basically just like start to characterize the trends and, the emotions and things like that. So as part of that data, as you can imagine, right, when we're talking about healthcare, and again, I think this is one of the critical domains, right, that where ethical AI is absolutely necessary when we're talking about disappropriate impact, or also just talking about in general privacy, right, talking about the type of data that we're willing to disclose. So when it comes to, that kind of data, we start to see data around, okay, maybe, potential diseases or disorders, symptoms, right, history, things like this. And one of the questions that, we started to ask is, how exactly can we take the same value out of this data without actually having to include that information, right? What can we do to actually have the same richness of those features that we need to build AI models, right? But that will also allow us to basically not use this data that is private, that is considered to be kind of something that, an employee would not disclose, even though it's a hypothetical use case. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was the realization, okay, let's use survey comments, right? And again, we're sacrificing a couple of the features that we get, but we're still getting a lot of rich data from the data that's already being provided to us by participants about their overall experience with the survey, how they feel about these types of activities, right? How they're feeling currently. So a lot of this kind of prompted some conversations, and internally for me at least, just kind of thinking about how can we make the best value out of data while ensuring that the entire process is ethical. Because at the end of the day, we talk about AI models, we talk about these techniques, but really the inputs and outputs of AI models are the fundamental, factors that have an impact on us, right? On the world around AI algorithms. The inputs are basically data coming in from the environment. They can include our bias, they can include our stereotypes, right? They often do. And then the outputs are being used to influence decisions out in the world. And that in turn can turn into this feedback loop, right? Where you just, keep kind of perpetuating sometimes bias unless it's caught and it's treated and identified. So just getting back to the example, I think that, this is, at least in me, kind of awakened this idea that, there are other ways other than the traditional ways of looking at data for us to kind of maximize privacy, prioritize privacy in these other principles, and think about ways we can extract better value out of data. So I think, again, Stacey and Ed have mentioned a lot of great points. Some of the words that really stood out to me is, consent, for example, making sure that the data you're gathering is something that's being voluntarily provided. And with that kind of data, you can extract a lot of value out of, what you're getting. So that's kind of a brief toy problem, right, around ethical AI. Of course, as part of, the workplace, we see a lot of things happening day to day. Again, of course, the industry has different perspectives compared to different types of organizations. And I've interfaced with quite a few, right, from startups to very, very big companies that, just have a global reach, that are like drivers in AI, right? To just, again, academic groups or nonprofit unions who just want to, have a say in this or be able to participate. And of course, governmental regulations as well. So, when we think about these, I think the fundamental problem is getting to a shared definition of AI, right? That's the ethical AI problem statement. How do you actually define AI algorithms? How do you make sure there's a baseline for them? And then how do you test them? That's the fundamental kind of challenges that we see day to day. Again, as I mentioned, some of the examples earlier are all examples that I've learned on the job, looking into and then being proactive around AI ethics. Like, for example, for a pedestrian detection algorithm for a self-driving vehicle, making sure that your data set is diverse. Or again, for a robotic arm in a facility, if you're developing an AI algorithm or using an AI algorithm for that use case, making sure that there's safety considerations, that there's uncertainty, and really, really clear testing. So, we see a lot of these issues day to day. And I'd say that, these are some of the fundamental kind of motivations and ways that I think that we can kind of approach them.
Thanks, Ria. Ed, what's an example of an ethical AI challenge that you've had to face during your career, and how did you address that?
It's a great question. So when I had one of the most interesting clients of mine I say early on in generative AI, it was maybe a year ago. And so she was an artist, and she wanted to develop art based on, in part, that used AI image generation software. And so she was using a product, I won't name it here, but she was using a product and felt really good about that. And I had to have a conversation with her around, look, the lineage of the IP that was used to train the model for this particular product is known to be questionable. You may be using someone else's work in order to generate yours in a way that does not give them credit and should not, at the end of the day, be used. And as an artist, she was really open to that perspective and wondered how she could do this, because she was very excited about the opportunities that lie in the future with regard to using art in AI in her art. And so what I guided her to do is look at a provider where the IP lineage of the foundation model was not questionable. There's Getty Images is a provider that uses only its own images. So that's a great example of one that's not going to run into regulatory challenges down the road that others might run into. And now I'm used to having that conversation with business leaders in terms of minimizing legal risk and liability, and trying to push that into the conversation around responsibility. This is what you as a corporate citizen should be thinking about anyway, not because it's better for you at the end of the day, but because it's better for society. And we really are still at the, kids playing with guns level of this. It's not quite safe. We don't know all the things that could be unexpected outcomes here. And so while I'm used to pushing that conversation in that direction in the corporate context, it was really great to hear this artist embrace the responsible aspect of it, the reasonable approach that was values based. I don't want to inappropriately use, leverage, steal someone else's IP in order to create my art. So that serves as an example that is a little different than a lot of the corporate context, but it was kind of refreshing, actually.
I think it's a great example. You mentioned IP lineage. Is there a way that our audience can inspect IP lineage of various algorithms or models out there? So is there anything that we can kind of give them to, dive into the weeds on that? Or is that something that really, is an ad hoc basis on research?
It's actually, it not only is it ad hoc, but it's specific to the model. I mean, this is the argument that you often hear by the big players who train their models on, what's scraped from the internet. We don't actually know, in part because that's one of the things that model creators hold dear to their chest, because they don't want to reveal what their sources are. But there are big questions and suspicions around that. And so the guidance that I would give is look into a foundation model and that provider and ask those questions of it. Not ask the actual foundation model and get a large, a representation. And if there is something around the lineage of the IP that is something that is most likely, they're going to be saying, yes, we used all of our own rights are known to all of the images, rights are known to all of the works. If there's nothing around that, then you should get suspicious. And so at the end of the day, technically, I really believe these foundation models' performance, they differ by performance now. Ultimately, that performance is going to asymptote out. And your ability to get the right your prompt engineering and your prompt architecture. And so it's not going to matter what foundation model you choose as much. So my guidance is go with a foundation model where you can confirm what that lineage is, rather than one of the more popular models that might not have that lineage well stated and well architected.
That's super helpful. Thanks, Ed. I know that we're running close to the FAQs, so I have two other questions I want to get to. We're going to do our best to keep it to a quarter two here. But this one's for Stacy. I think that it would be a big miss if we didn't include this. Earlier this year, the EU passed a law called the AI Act, the world's first governmental regulation of AI. And then this week, Stanford released its AI index, which found that AI-related regulations in the US have grown by about 56% year over year. What is AI regulation, and what role does it have in ensuring AI development is ethical?
So AI regulation, of course, is, created by regulatory bodies, government bodies, in order to carry out law and policies that manage risk and also will create legal clarity and establish these ethical standards that we're hoping that we get to, and making sure that the AI is safe for consumers to use and also responsible. But regulation is essential for ensuring that AI development adheres to our existing, because we do have existing, privacy laws that promote fairness, laws that encourage transparency. And so it's really making sure in this specific sector that there's now specific, almost prescriptive policies and regulations to outline what can be and cannot be done as it pertains to AI development and deployment. When we think about enforcement measures, it's important to ensure that they're building in things with teeth in it, like fines, and it has to be significant fines, especially when we're dealing with, big multinational companies. And so in the state of California, we already have, as you know, the CCPA, which has, significant fines to ensure that, privacy laws are adhered to and companies are protecting our data. And so it has to be kind of consistent within, the historical ways and precedents of how laws have been made. So I think these are good measures in terms of what needs to be done to give us kind of a consistency and to standardize processes, so that things just aren't all over the place where it's different in this country, different in the state. And so, regulations kind of help to really streamline the development of of AI as we're going forward. And so I think, we are going in the right direction, but in the world of, the human rights advocacy, they would say that it's not strong enough when we think about, are we focusing on laws that allow for using AI for productivity purposes and commerce and being able to, monetize certain things out of, AI legislation? And to what extent are we giving up some of our privacy rights, our human rights for this benefit of AI? So it's also making sure that there's regulations that have the right approach and it's balanced enough to ensure that we're not trading one for the other.
Thanks, Stacey. I'll end with this question, and maybe we can do a quick round robin here. The question is this: what are some common ethical AI gotchas that listeners can look out for as they develop AI systems? We'll start with you, Stacey.
So when we think of AI gotchas, can you just elaborate a little bit on what you mean exactly?
Sure. So maybe a specific thing that you've seen over and over that usually leads to questionable ethical AI decisions.
Right. So one of the things, again, because of the speed of easy access to using some of these systems that have that have come out, we say yes to using certain types of new tools or certain types of generative AI tool and don't realize how much access we're now giving them to our personal data. And again, it's not really clear to us what's being sold, if it's being shared with third parties, and this can include a lot of our personal data because, again, we are consenting to using some of these systems. And so we have a society where we're all just trying to, keep up and go with the wave of things and not understanding what we're giving away as pertains to our rights. I do know recently, and it was very interesting, they were rolling out like more of these kind of automated grocery stores. And there was like a callback on a certain corporation, which I won't name, where they're now closing these stores, which I found interesting. And they were really trying to use AI to just make the store operate on its own. And then they had to call it back because I think there was more humans involved than they thought there were. And so in terms of the cost of maintaining it was more than they anticipated. And so we're kind of, rolling these things out so quickly without properly testing, without properly monitoring. And then because of that, you have to scale out, you have to scale back. And so those are some of the examples that, I can think of.
Thanks, Stacey. Ria?
I think that Stacey really articulated the key points. I think I'll just kind of add to that, and I think we've been talking about it a lot, right? A lot of, what, I've been mentioning as well throughout this conversation are kind of, looking at concerns, looking at issues and like key elements. And I think one of the key gotchas, like overall, when you enter the field is that, yes, it is kind of like a list of problem statements, essentially. It's very challenging to kind of achieve a specific type of solution without actually doing more research and more deep dives into it. So, when you are actually presented, and again, if you're somebody who wants to kind of be a participant in this space and contribute, again, whether that means that you have a designated role in your organization or whether you're a learner or, again, a concerned citizen, right? No matter what your kind of role and responsibility is, if you do want to contribute to the conversation and you kind of step into the ethical AI space as a beginner, you'll immediately see this, right? There's so many different concerns and elements and opinions that are going to pop out at you immediately as soon as you're entering this space. And I think that can be a really big gotcha just because, there's so much information to navigate. And then again, so many different perspectives that are kind of in contention with each other. So I think that, again, like a way to kind of solve this or to get past this is to really think about, a systematic approach towards approaching it. Maybe that means that you prioritize some ethical AI principles over others for a given time period. And that's perfectly okay, right? If you're able to acknowledge that, if you're doing it via an organization, then acknowledging it publicly or acknowledging it in the way that you can, it does make sense to kind of take steps towards achieving an ethical AI strategy. And again, to find solutions for your customized use cases, whether that's establishing metrics, or like Ed mentioned, establishing an IP lineage and actually committing, to going through and researching and understanding better which foundation models you're leveraging. Or as Stacey mentioned, understanding humans in the loop, right? Understanding how you're empowering your human stakeholders and the folks that are, going to be impacted by this, the folks who are doing the work, right? Especially this is true for, annotators, right? For example, who are annotating all of the data that's getting trained to these models. So a lot of these, kind of bundle up under that domain, I'd say, of, just understanding that, things are not going to be easy as part of that, but, taking the first step and then thinking about these things systematically is the best way to avoid this gotcha. So again, I'll stop there. That's a very quick explanation.
Thanks, Ria. Ed, do you have anything to add?
Just very quickly, you can't go wrong by, first of all, these great answers. I'm learning so much here. You can't go wrong by involving there are such interplays between cultural context and language, and especially as language models are what runs a lot of these AI systems.
Thanks, Ed. I think we're losing your internet a bit, so we may have to regroup on that one. We'll move now to the FAQs from the audience, and I'll start with the first one here. And this is, I think, a good one for both Ria and then Stacy as well. Can you talk about job opportunities and how to move into an AI ethicist career? Start with you, Ria.
Okay, absolutely. It's a wonderful question. I think that, this space is booming, right? But there's also a real opportunity to make an impact, a real weight, right, around the title of working in trustworthy AI and responsible AI. And by weight, I mean, you're working on challenging problems every day that make a difference, right? That are actually impacting, both folks that you're working with, but also, right, the users, the stakeholders of your technology, as we've been mentioning throughout this webinar. So I'd say that, the fundamental part of this is being able to position yourself as someone who knows about these concepts, right? Acknowledging the importance of ethical AI, understanding why it's important, right? And again, as I mentioned, understanding, some of these systematic steps that you think should be taken, right, is important. And all of this is to say, like establishing that personal perspective on where you stand when it comes to ethical AI. That means that, for example, you may need to research about technical documents a little bit. You may need to keep up to date on, regulations, just reading policy briefs as much as you can, right? But, basically being able to detail and identify these help prep you for jobs. And then to answer that second part, which is what did the jobs look like? They come in a variety of different angles, right? And I think that's reflected by the diversity of expertise on this panel. So, just for example, from an industry perspective, there's designated roles, right, for responsible and ethical and trustworthy AI, depending on which discipline you're interested in, right? That are really focused sometimes on technical angles, program manager angles, director positions, right? And also auditing positions. So there's a number of different roles that you can position yourself for depending on the exact type of ethical AI and the way that you want to apply it. There's also job-specific roles, right? Like privacy engineer, or AI sustainability engineer, right? These are up and coming. So identifying the discipline that you're interested in, that you think that you can contribute well to and that aligns with your interest, and then learning more about the space and building up to it would be my best recommendation. But of course, would love to hear Stacy's thoughts too.
Yes. Thank you, Ria. And just to add to that, so definitely start with your strengths and start with the discipline that you're already in to see how that can add value. And so even if you're an accountant who's thinking of transitioning, think of now some of the inequities within AI in the financial sector and how that lens could be of value. I highly suggest thinking of fellowships and making research of fellowships. There's tons of them, especially United States, state by state. And so you want to start looking at different think tanks and seeing what type of fellowships they have that may be very specific to ethical AI so that you can strengthen your skills, your understanding, and understanding how things are being applied to on the ground. Look at what some of the advocacy groups are saying about issues, reading their white paper, their recommendations for how we can ensure we have ethical AI. The African Union just launched their white paper for their national strategy on AI, which is something that I'd highly recommend, looking at that. And so it's also important to be present in your community and literally go to a lot of the career development sessions and seminars on anything to do with AI and ethical AI specifically, because this is a great way to hear from other experts. It's a great way to expand your network with those in the field and also identify opportunities that you may not even know existed, right? And that was some of my exploration where there's certain opportunities I wouldn't have known that AI policy was going to become such a big thing. I was more looking at tech policy at first a few years ago, and then now I'm seeing more of this emerging sector for AI policy. So when we think about, the different sectors, whether it's in the not-for-profit sector, they're wanting to adopt, AI as well. And so you could be that person that could help with the adoption. So you want to look for those opportunities, look for what's popping up in the public sector sector in terms of jobs, and of course, the private sector where they may need somebody kind of with a different type of approach for the department. So when I think of like, tech companies, not too often people may consider doing public affairs or being a government relations professional in that sector because you think it's all technical, but they have an accounting department, they have a marketing department, and there's so many ways that you can add value and maybe, tie it into artificial intelligence and the intersection with these different departments. And so, this is a great question, and thank you for the question.
Great. Thanks both for those answers. This next question is from Isaac. Is there a difference between AI ethics and responsible AI? Stacy, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say because we have this expectation of, government and corporations to, do what's right, you're expecting them to use it responsibly and do the due diligence that's required to make sure that they just don't roll something out again without the monitoring, without the assessment, without the testing. And then when I think of ethics, it's really hard to legislate ethics because we're getting in the weeds of like what's morally right, what's morally wrong, who's benefiting and who's not. And everybody's perspective is different. And it also depends on what part of the world you're coming from, because a lot of how we think and believe as a society is shaped by political ideologies. In certain ways, we're conditioned to think. And so it's really having that understanding that when we think of harms to the environment and when we think of harms to people, that should be a universal fundamental value as it pertains to the core heart of what ethics is all about. And so that's how I would distinguish the two.
Ria, do you have anything to add to that?
I just want to say I love Stacey's way of phrasing it. And yes, that's absolutely on dot. I would say, I mean, from my experience, responsible AI is again really emphasizing on that responsibility part of organizations to kind of take on this, the challenges, but also the opportunities, right, that ethical AI presents because it's critical. But yes, I mean, to folks in the audience who are just starting out, it can be kind of confusing to see all of the different definitions. I personally see ethical AI as something synonymous with responsible AI. Of course, when it comes to the details, they do have distinctions, right? When it comes to the individual kind of tasks and to-do items for each of them. But ethical AI is really that, I think, mother of all of these subsets, right? So you can really think of it as very similar and all kind of grouped under this, the same umbrella, at least when you're starting out, right? And just familiarizing yourself with these definitions. But completely agree with everything Stacey mentioned.
Thanks, Ria. I think we have time for one more question. So we'll take this one from Vincent Bett. How can we address issues of algorithmic fairness and ensure that AI systems do not perpetuate or exacerbate existing inequalities? Stacy, do you want to give that one a first take?
Certainly. How do we do that with these algorithmic bias? Because again, I mean, I'm in the world of public affairs, and so I do want to touch on the role of lobbying and what we can do with citizens or aligning with organizations that are really trying to lobby for the greater good of society, because you need to have governments is also looking to us for solutions and they want ideas, right? And so there are organizations that are pushing for this, but there's other organizations, sometimes in the private sector, not always, that are louder than others, and sometimes their needs get prioritized. And so you almost want to incentivize removing these biases, but there's systemic inequalities in our world that first need to be addressed before we start digitizing and automating decisions. So we don't want to have a society where we're automating legal decisions that impact people without human oversight. And so it's making sure that you do have these strong checks and balances. You have to have the human oversight because we're dealing with historical data that has biases. So until that data is addressed, then we're going to basically digitize and amplify these inequalities. And also if we're moving forward where we're excluding certain people who don't have access, who can't afford not just a smartphone, but even the cost of internet, right? That's really costly for a lot of people. And so it's really making sure that the systemic inequalities in the traditional way of how we were living is addressed before we start digitizing these systems that were already filled with inequalities to begin with, right? So that in itself is really challenging because you want to get to the root cause of these things. And that's what's always been difficult when we think of, people in the space of human rights advocacy, like they're constantly up against things that are centuries years old in terms of how we got here as a society where, people are treated differently and we do have these systems of inequalities.
Perfect. Thanks, Stacy. Ria, I'll give you one chance here to add to that. Otherwise, we can go ahead and end the webinar.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just describe this really quickly. So I want to pull on something that Stacy mentioned, right, just for the audience, and also because I can see the question in the chat too. But one of the questions is around like manipulating AI model outputs, right? So fundamentally, when we're talking about kind of inequalities and fairness and the definition of it, we're not necessarily manipulating the AI model's outputs in any use case, right? The whole point of it is being able to map what exactly is happening in the data, ground truth. And this is the fundamental part of AI development from an ethical perspective that's really crucial, which is the truth, right? We actually look at the existing mapping of whatever is going on within the data, and we make sure that that's an accurate representation of the environment around us. That doesn't necessarily mean that we mask anything or that we're removing details, but we're making sure that it's accurate. Again, whether that's from a outcomes perspective, or whether that's how much data we have allocated to different elements, right? Or to different populations, to folks of different genders, skin tones, etc. So we check if the data is representative of the environment, and then we make sure that the AI model is also not skewing that data to have a different kind of representation than what's already part of the environment, right? So at the end of the day, we're kind of stabilizing that perspective around this is the input, this is the expected output, and then we work from there. So, again, for, folks who have, some of these questions around, the kind of like this kind of element of what exactly we're doing for the manipulation, we're really kind of trying to reflect the ground truth of the environment and then make sure that that's incorporated in the AI model in a way that is actually having, the right outputs, the outputs that we're expecting that we can manage accordingly. And that, again, as Stacy mentioned, are in accordance with the local laws and also with the global regulations as well. So that's how I'd recommend thinking about it. We're really not, going in and kind of changing things around, but actually, applying these processes to make sure that we know what exactly the AI model is doing and the outputs it's generating. So that's my personal 2 cents, right, on how to think about it.
Appreciate that, Ria. I think the one piece I will add to that, which we spoke about earlier in the discussion as well, is just the importance of testing and metrics when it comes to understanding fairness. And so getting ahead of it during algorithm development, making sure that you have the right testing model to run at those biases and validate that you are not biased before you roll out to production. With that, I just wanted to take a moment to thank the panelists. Ria, Stacy, Ed, really appreciate you joining us and sharing your point of views today. And also want to take a moment to thank the production team for making this possible. So thanks so much for all of the folks in the back end for making this possible. Hope that those in the audience had a good time with this and found value in the discussion. And we hope to do other webinars like this soon. So if you have any other questions about ethical AI, Udacity has a slew of content in the AI and ethical AI space. Ria and Stacy both have courses that you can take, and likely stay tuned for more coming. Thanks so much, and we'll hope to hear from you all soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.